They showed up at our door in fake police uniforms, demanding we correct our flower colors. I was standing on my own porch, watching grown adults in cheap dollar store uniforms lecture my wife about HOA rules that didn't even apply to us. She calmly told them, "We don't belong to your HOA." You'd think that would be the end, but almost immediately it felt like someone had flipped a switch. Threatening notes appeared, forged documents were slipped under our door, and strange cars began circling our block like vultures. Something was seriously wrong, and it was only getting worse. How far would this HOA go to assert control over a house they didn't even own? Before the chaos began, life in our quiet suburban neighborhood felt perfectly ordinary. Our street was lined with neatly trimmed lawns, pastel-colored homes, and the occasional child's bicycle leaning against a driveway. Mornings were calm, with sunlight spilling over the sidewalks and neighbors waving as they headed off to work. My wife and I had chosen this community for its charm and sense of safety, envisioning a place where we could build memories without constant stress or confrontation. We spent weekends tending to our garden, laughing over coffee on the porch, and greeting familiar faces during evening walks. We weren't flashy people, nor did we seek attention. Our home reflected simplicity and care, a modest, well-maintained property with bright flowers and a lawn that got more compliments than complaints. We had no desire to disrupt the neighborhood balance, only to quietly enjoy our lives. The children played safely in the yard and, for the most part, our neighbors respected each other's boundaries. At first glance, nothing about us seemed controversial, and that was precisely why the events that followed felt so surreal. Subtle signs of the HOA's rigid oversight occasionally emerged. Newsletters detailing new guidelines for lawn ornament, placement, reminders about paint colors, or notices about mailbox designs. It always felt a bit intrusive, yet nothing alarming, so we didn't give it much attention. Occasionally, a neighbor mentioned a rule or some petty guideline enforced by the HOA president, but these were easily shrugged off. We thought of them as minor annoyances, bureaucratic quirks of suburban life, not the precursor to what would become a full-blown power struggle. The first inkling of trouble came when we received a vague letter about violations on our property. It was minor, something about flower colors that apparently didn't align with HOA standards. We laughed it off at first, assuming it was a mistake. This slight misunderstanding could be easily resolved with a polite reply. However, there was an odd tone to the correspondence, a rigid insistence that didn't align with the supposed friendliness of the community. Even then, the tension was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the faint crack in a window pane before a storm. Little did we know that this slight discrepancy was just the spark that ignited a larger issue. Beneath the surface of our serene neighborhood lurked a network of rules enforced with near-obsessive authority. The HOA president, a figure of unexpected rigidity and ambition, seemed poised to escalate trivial matters into personal vendettas. What began as a minor issue with flowers would quickly escalate into a series of confrontations, forged documents, and intimidation tactics that would transform our peaceful street into a battleground. Every neighborly interaction, every casual wave, could soon carry suspicion or hidden motives. In retrospect, it wasn't the flowers or the lawn that sparked the conflict. It was the assertion of control, the need for dominance disguised as community maintenance. We were about to discover that when power meets obsession, even the simplest disagreements can escalate into situations that test patience, courage, and sanity. Our ordinary life, full of morning coffees, evening walks, and garden tending, was about to be overshadowed by absurdity, intimidation, and the kind of petty cruelty we never imagined existed behind white picket fences. As the days passed, we began noticing subtle changes in the neighborhood. A neighbor who previously greeted us with a smile now gave curt nods, avoiding eye contact. Vehicles appeared on our street at odd hours, lingering longer than necessary. Flyers and letters seemed to multiply, all hinting at violations or expected compliance. The once calm and welcoming environment now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny, of eyes watching our every move. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about sending a message, establishing who held power, and demonstrating the consequences of stepping outside of it. And so, as we continued our daily routines, tending to the flowers, mowing the lawn, and greeting familiar faces, a quiet tension grew beneath the surface. What seemed like a minor HOA infraction was quietly building into something far larger, something that would push the boundaries of reason, patience, and civility. The calm before the storm was deceptive. The ordinary life we cherished was about to be tested in ways we could never have anticipated. The stage was set, the players in position, and the first move in this unexpected battle over property, pride, and power was waiting just around the corner. Almost immediately after the first warning about the flower colors, the situation escalated in ways that seemed nearly surreal. What had begun as a minor bureaucratic annoyance soon snowballed into a relentless campaign of intimidation and harassment, orchestrated by the HOA with a precision that was as absurd as it was alarming. The letters became more frequent, each one more aggressive than the last, outlining violations that seemed to multiply overnight. The colors of our flowers were suddenly the least of our worries. It was now our fences, our mailbox, even the angle at which our blinds tilted, all scrutinized under rules that were never clearly defined and often contradicted previous correspondence. One morning I found another notice slipped under the front door. The paper was thin, the print was small, and the language was so formal that it bordered on threatening. "Immediate action required," it read. "Non-compliance will result in fines and further enforcement measures." I stared at it, incredulous. Fines? Enforcement measures? For flowers and lawn ornaments? My wife and I exchanged glances, both of us struggling to overcome disbelief and frustration. We had lived here peacefully, respecting the community and its unspoken norms. And yet, in what felt like the blink of an eye, we were being treated as if we were deliberate provocateurs. Soon after, the first face-to-face encounter occurred. I was outside trimming the hedges when a man in a cheap uniform approached, clipboard in hand. His expression was stern, almost comically serious, as he pointed out supposed infractions. I asked for his identification, and he insisted he was an authorized representative of the HOA's enforcement division. He wasn't a police officer, yet. He carried himself with the authority of one, and the absurdity of the situation made it even more surreal. I tried to explain our ownership and compliance. Still, my words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall of bureaucracy and ego. Each passing day brought new challenges. Notices appeared not just at our home, but also in our mailbox at work, in email chains, and even on our neighbors' doors, warning them of potential community disruptions caused by our property. The HOA seemed determined to turn every minor infraction into a spectacle. They questioned the type of mulch we used, the placement of our garden gnomes, and even the orientation of our porch swing. Every attempt at compliance was met with a new, often contradictory demand. Frustration mounted as we realized the HOA wasn't seeking resolution but escalation, relishing in the power it could exert over our daily lives. Late one evening, as shadows stretched across our lawn, a new development occurred. Forged notices appeared, claiming violations we had never committed. The documents were convincingly crafted, complete with logos and signatures that looked legitimate at first glance. My wife discovered one pinned to the door, reading accusations about property boundaries and unauthorized construction. Our calm neighborhood, once a sanctuary, had become a theater of intimidation. Who could we trust? Every knock at the door, every piece of mail, now carried an undertone of threat. It wasn't just paperwork. Strange vehicles began to appear on the street at odd hours. Some lingered for minutes, others circled slowly, tires, crunching on gravel in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I took note of license plates, but the vehicles disappeared before I could confront them. The sense of being watched became constant, gnawing at our sense of safety. We weren't paranoid. The patterns were too consistent to ignore. The HOA's power, once limited to letters and warnings, now seemed to extend into our physical space, and it was terrifying. Neighborly interactions became tinged with tension. Some friends who had previously waved or smiled now avoided eye contact. Conversations were clipped, polite but distant. Occasionally, a neighbor would hint at fear, speaking in hushed tones about past conflicts with the HOA. I began to piece together a pattern. The organization thrived on fear, on the silent complicity of those around it. Their rules were arbitrary, their enforcement selective, yet their power felt absolute. Every interaction, every notice, every glance from a car driving slowly past our home seemed like another move in a game we had never agreed to play. The fines, when they arrived, were staggering in their absurdity. Hundreds of dollars for imperceptible infractions. We received itemized statements with charges for improper landscaping, unauthorized color selection, and even exceeding permitted wind resistance on outdoor fixtures. Each note was more ridiculous than the last, yet each carried the weight of official authority. My attempts to appeal were met with procedural delays, forms that contradicted each other, and responses that sidestepped questions rather than addressing them directly. It became clear that the HOA wasn't interested in dialogue or fairness. It was about exerting control and testing boundaries. One afternoon, a confrontation reached new heights. My wife was gardening when a group of individuals arrived, claiming to represent the HOA's enforcement team. They were not police officers, yet they carried clipboards, cameras, and a demeanor that suggested officialdom. She calmly explained our property ownership and compliance with the guidelines, but her words seemed to dissipate into thin air. The group lingered, taking notes and photographs, inspecting angles and measurements as if we were subjects in a case study. I watched from the porch, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and helplessness washing over me. This was no longer about flowers or fences. It was about dominance, intimidation, and the assertion of power over people who had done nothing to provoke it. As days turned into weeks, the pattern of harassment intensified. Visits followed notices, fines followed visits, threats of legal action accompanied fines. Every attempt to comply with one demand led to the discovery of another infraction, often fabricated or exaggerated. It felt like a game designed to break our resolve. Each escalation left us more exhausted, more wary, more determined to resist. The absurdity of it all, the dollar store uniforms, the petty inspections, the endless paperwork, contrasted sharply with the very real emotional toll it took. The psychological strain was compounded by the way neighbors reacted. Some were openly supportive, but many were cautious, wary of aligning with us against the HOA. Gossip spread quickly, creating divisions where none had existed before. Friends began avoiding discussions about property issues, afraid that association with us might invite scrutiny. Even simple acts like hosting a barbecue or leaving decorations on the lawn became exercises in vigilance, ensuring we did not inadvertently violate some invisible shifting rule. In the midst of this, small victories emerged, each one followed almost immediately by new challenges. A complaint we lodged about forged notices was dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Yet, the HOA continued to reference the same fabricated documents in later correspondence. Our calls for mediation were delayed or ignored. Attempts to clarify rules were met with cryptic replies that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. These moments of partial success felt hollow, quickly overshadowed by new absurdities and injustices. Then came the legal threats. Letters arrived, suggesting that continued non-compliance could result in liens, property seizures, and public filings against us. The tone was formal, yet every word was laced with a hint of intimidation. My wife and I were now forced to consider hiring attorneys. This prospect seemed ridiculous given the trivial nature of the alleged violations. Yet the threat of legal action loomed large, a constant shadow over our daily lives. Every movement, every decision regarding our property carried potential consequences. Even mundane activities became exercises in strategy and caution, choosing when to mow the lawn, which flowers to plant, or even how to angle a potted plant required careful consideration. A simple choice could trigger a notice, a fine, or a visit from one of the so-called enforcement officers. The absurdity of regulating such minute details clashed with the psychological pressure we endured, creating a sense of living under constant siege. Social isolation compounded the stress. Invitations from neighbors dwindled, casual conversations were curtailed. Even family members visiting from out of town were cautioned about interacting too openly with the neighborhood, lest it be interpreted as defiance. The HOA's influence extended far beyond letters and visits. It permeated relationships, social, trust, and the very perception of safety in our own homes. Despite the mounting pressure, our determination grew. We meticulously documented every interaction, saved every letter, and photographed every absurd inspection. What initially seemed like a simple dispute over flowers had evolved into a full-scale campaign of harassment, testing not only our patience, but our resilience. Each new notice, each visit, each fine became a point of evidence, a testament to the lengths an organization could go to assert dominance over residents. And just when we thought we had reached the limit of absurdity, the situation took an even darker turn. One evening, as twilight descended, a group of unfamiliar cars appeared, parked at odd angles, engines running intermittently. Figures moved inside, sometimes lingering near the edges of our property. My wife and I watched from the windows, our hearts pounding as we realized that the conflict was no longer confined to letters and fines. It had spilled into our physical space. Fear, tension, and disbelief mingled as we contemplated what the HOA might do next. At that moment, the stakes became clear. This was no longer a battle about aesthetics, about petty rules, or about minor fines. It was about asserting authority, about demonstrating that the HOA could control our lives, our property, and our peace of mind. Every escalation, every absurd demand, every fabricated notice had led to this point. And yet, we had no choice but to endure, to strategize, and to prepare for whatever came next. The rising action was relentless, the pressure unyielding, and the conclusion, still unknown, loomed just beyond the horizon. The stage was set for confrontation, each event building on the last, each notice, visit, and strange occurrence, ratcheting the tension higher. Our home, once a sanctuary, had become a theater of anxiety and absurdity. The HOA had transformed trivial infractions into a sustained campaign of psychological and logistical warfare. Every day, every interaction, and every decision carried weight, and every moment of calm felt like a reprieve before the subsequent escalation. As we moved forward, navigating the ever-shifting maze of rules, fines, and threats, one truth became undeniable. This conflict was no longer about flowers or fences. It was about power, control, and the lengths an organization would go to assert dominance over residents who dared to question its authority. And as the tension continued to mount, one question lingered in our minds. How far would they go, and what would it take to bring an end to the madness finally? The relentless series of encounters, documents, and threats created a mounting sense of dread and anticipation, a pressure cooker of tension that made every decision feel critical. The HOA's interference was now an inescapable part of daily life, and the line between absurdity and menace blurred with each passing day. The community we had once cherished, the quiet street lined with familiar faces, had become a battleground. Every letter, every visit, every car circling the block pushed us closer to a breaking point. And yet, even amid the fear, frustration, and mounting absurdity, the resolve to resist, document, and expose the HOA's tactics grew stronger. The rising action had reached its peak of psychological intensity, setting the stage for an inevitable climax. This confrontation would test not only our patience and ingenuity, but also the HOA's willingness to maintain its grip on power. In the weeks that followed, the story would only grow more intense. Each escalation, each bizarre rule, each threatening notice brought us closer to a dramatic showdown. The HOA's tactics had transformed from minor annoyances into a full-scale psychological siege, and the narrative of our neighborhood life had shifted irreversibly. We were no longer merely residents tending to a home. We had become unwilling participants in a high-stakes struggle against arbitrary authority, with every detail of our lives subject to scrutiny, manipulation, and control. The tension continued. To mount, the absurdity deepened and the conflict intensified, setting up a climax that promised to be as shocking, emotionally charged, and dramatic as the weeks of harassment that had led to it and every moment of rising action had built toward. This inevitable confrontation, leaving us and the viewers following our story on the edge of our seats, anticipating the moment when all of the HOA's tactics, tricks, and overreach would finally collide with the resolve and determination of the homeowners who refused to be intimidated. The tension had been building for weeks, even months, with every interaction with the HOA pushing us closer to the edge of patience and reason. By the time the day of the confrontation arrived, every nerve in my body was taut with anticipation. We knew the HOA's president thrived on theatrics and power plays, and we were determined not to let the absurdity and intimidation continue without exposing it for what it truly was. That morning, the street was quiet, deceptively calm, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. We had spent countless hours preparing, documenting every letter, photograph, and incident that had occurred. The files were thick, evidence of harassment, fabricated violations, and intimidation tactics that bordered on criminal. We knew this confrontation would not be resolved with polite explanations or compromise. The HOA had made it clear that dialogue was ineffective. Their primary goal was to control, dominate, and assert authority over anyone who challenged them. This would be the turning point, the moment where their arrogance would either crumble under scrutiny or escalate into chaos. As the appointed time arrived, a convoy of vehicles approached, unmistakably linked to the HOA enforcement team. Their presence was as theatrical as it was absurd. Multiple adults in mismatched uniforms, clipboards in hand, cameras at the ready, each moving with exaggerated purpose. They claimed authority over our property, our decisions, and even our lives. But the preparation we had undertaken meant we were no longer passive participants. Every step, every glance, every note taken by them was met with a silent countermeasure. Evidence had been organized, witnesses prepared, and legal counsel on standby. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. We were ready to confront not just the absurdity, but the audacity of their overreach. The first exchange was verbal, a mixture of threats, demands, and performative authority. One officer-like figure stepped forward, insisting we correct violations immediately or face fines, liens, and legal repercussions. My wife remained calm, refusing to acknowledge the intimidation. Her composure, measured and confident, contrasted sharply with the aggressiveness of the HOA representatives. Each word they spat in formality and assumed power was met with concise, factual rebuttals supported by documentation. I could feel the tension ripple through the group, their confidence beginning to falter under scrutiny they had never anticipated. Then came the moment of escalation. One representative, frustrated by the lack of compliance, attempted to physically approach the property line, claiming authority to inspect beyond what was legally permissible. I stepped forward, firmly blocking their path, citing property ownership, and state law as justification. The standoff was intense. Bodies tense, voices raised, cameras rolling, the air charged with a mixture of absurdity and danger. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and through windows drawn by the spectacle. Some whispered to each other, incredulous that such a dispute could reach this level over flowers, fences, and arbitrary rules. The HOA president arrived shortly thereafter, a figure of authority now visibly flustered. They attempted to regain control, demanding we comply immediately and threatening swift legal action. We responded calmly but assertively, presenting the evidence, forged documents, inconsistencies in past notices, photographs of their own contradictory claims, and witness statements from neighbors who had observed the harassment. The air seemed to shift. The performance, the theatrics, and the assumed omnipotence of the HOA began to crumble under the weight of undeniable facts. The confrontation escalated further when one representative attempted to seize a minor piece of property, a flowerbed ornament, claiming it violated community guidelines. My wife intervened, refusing to allow the removal without proper legal documentation. This moment, small in isolation but monumental in context, marked a turning point. The HOA representatives, realizing their authority was being challenged and documented, hesitated, confusion replacing their performative aggression. Their once rigid demeanor cracked, revealing the human uncertainty beneath the uniform facade. Legal counsel, previously waiting on the periphery, stepped forward to clarify the ramifications of their actions. The combination of prepared evidence, factual rebuttals, and legal presence created a cascade effect. The HOA, which had built its power on intimidation, was now forced to confront its own overreach. Each threat, each fabricated notice, each fine suddenly appeared hollow against the reality we presented. Witnesses nodded in quiet affirmation, neighbors murmured support, and even some of the more hesitant enforcement officers began to question the chain of commands they had followed unthinkingly. Then came the final blow to their performance. The revelation that, contrary to their repeated claims, our property ownership included parts of the land the HOA had attempted to regulate. My wife had quietly gathered the deeds, easements, and historical records over the course of weeks, anticipating the potential for a confrontation. When presented, the documents were irrefutable. The expressions on their faces shifted from defiance to disbelief. The tension, previously one-sided, now balances on the fulcrum of undeniable fact. We were no longer at the mercy of arbitrary rules. We were empowered by truth and preparation. As the standoff continued, a crowd of neighbors had gathered, drawn by the spectacle. Their presence added social weight, serving as a silent jury that witnessed the unraveling of an organization that had long relied on secrecy, intimidation, and compliance. Each neighbor's observation was a subtle reinforcement of our position. The absurdity and cruelty of the HOA's tactics could no longer be hidden. Public accountability had arrived, amplifying the psychological pressure on the representatives. The climax reached its peak when the HOA president, flustered and visibly frustrated, attempted one last maneuver, an ultimatum threatening immediate legal escalation if we did not comply. My wife, calm and composed, delivered a response that echoed with quiet authority. She laid out the facts, referenced legal protections, and highlighted the history of harassment, fraud, and intimidation orchestrated by the HOA. The representatives, now exposed and overextended, had no credible response. Their threats rang hollow in the face of evidence, public scrutiny, and the unwavering confidence of the homeowners they sought to dominate. In the final moments of the confrontation, as the representatives retreated with flushed faces and diminished authority, a palpable sense of triumph filled the air. The absurdity that had once been terrifying now appeared almost farcical. Their attempts at intimidation, their performative enforcement, and their reliance on fear and bureaucracy had been dismantled in one sustained, evidence-backed confrontation. The psychological victory was immense. The homeowners had resisted, documented, and prevailed without resorting to aggression, relying instead on clarity, preparation, and the undeniable truth of their ownership. Yet, even in victory, the aftermath was tense. Although the immediate confrontation had ended, the HOA's presence continued to linger in the neighborhood. Notices, though tempered, continued to arrive. Some officers or representatives would still appear, but the dynamics had fundamentally shifted. The balance of power was no longer one-sided. We had asserted our rights, exposed the absurdities, and demonstrated that the HOA's authority was neither absolute nor unchallengeable. Neighbors began to approach cautiously, offering quiet congratulations, sharing their own stories of minor infractions and subtle intimidation. The ripple effect of the confrontation was already spreading. The HOA's reputation, once unquestioned, was now subject to scrutiny and doubt. We realized that the psychological impact extended beyond our property. The precedent had been set, showing others that compliance through fear was not the only option, and that evidence, persistence, and courage could dismantle even the most seemingly entrenched authority. The climax was not just a single moment, but a sustained peak of tension, confrontation, and revelation. It combined legal, psychological, and social elements to deliver a decisive turning point in the story. The HOA, which had relied on a combination of bureaucratic authority, intimidation, and community complicity, had been exposed and undermined. We had endured weeks of harassment, stress, and absurdity. We emerged not just unbroken, but vindicated, ready to reclaim our home and our peace of mind. As the representatives finally departed, muttering excuses and reassessing their own authority, a sense of calm settled over the property. The street, once filled with tension and subtle threats, returned to a semblance of normalcy. However, the lessons of the confrontation remained vivid. Power could be challenged, authority could be questioned, and even the most absurd and overreaching organizations could be held accountable when faced with evidence, preparation, and unwavering resolve. And yet, as we looked around at our home, our street, and the community we had long cherished, one thought lingered in the back of our minds. The conflict was over, but the story was not finished. The resolution would come, but only after the dust settled and the neighbors had processed what had happened. The HOA recalibrated its tactics in the aftermath. The climax delivered justice, tension, and drama. However, the final impact, the long-term consequences and ultimate satisfaction, was still waiting to unfold. In that charged moment, as we locked the door and took a deep breath, we understood the true magnitude of what had just occurred. We had faced absurdity, intimidation, and bureaucratic overreach at its peak, and survived. The stage was set for the final act. This resolution would bring closure, accountability, and a sense of lasting peace to a neighborhood transformed by weeks of conflict. The story, like the tension itself, had reached its apex. Every letter, every visit, every threat had led to this culmination of confrontation and revelation. The HOA's authority had been challenged, its tactics exposed, and the homeowners had emerged not only unscathed, but triumphant. And as we prepared to move into the resolution, one question remained. How would the aftermath unfold, and what consequences would ultimately solidify the lessons of this battle over power, property, and principle? After the climactic confrontation, a strange stillness settled over our home. The street, once alive with tension and subtle threats, now felt quiet but charged with possibility. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, observing cautiously as if to see what the fallout would be from the spectacle they had witnessed. The HOA representatives had left, their authority visibly shaken, yet we knew this wasn't the end. The long-term consequences and resolution still had to unfold. The days following, we focused on documenting the aftermath. Every letter, email, and notice that trickled in was meticulously saved. Unlike before, however, these communications carried a different tone. The threats, once veiled behind bureaucratic jargon and performative authority, had softened. It was as if the HOA had recognized that their methods could no longer intimidate or manipulate us without exposure. Every attempt to enforce minor infractions was now measured, cautious, and weighed against the public and legal precedents set during the confrontation. Our interactions with neighbors also shifted. People who had previously maintained a polite distance now approached, sharing whispered stories of similar experiences with the HOA. Some admitted to minor annoyances, petty fines, or subtle intimidation they had endured but never documented. Others asked for guidance, curious how we had managed to confront an organization so entrenched in the community. These conversations reinforced that our stand had ripple effects beyond our property. It had exposed a system of overreach, emboldened others to resist, and created an environment where transparency and accountability were demanded. The HOA's internal dynamics began to show signs of strain. Members who had once supported rigid enforcement were now hesitant, their confidence shaken by the public. Exposure of overreach. Meetings became more procedural and less performative, often scrutinized by multiple residents who had grown wary of unchecked authority. In essence, the balance of power had shifted. Where once fear maintained control, now accountability and scrutiny reigned. The neighborhood had witnessed firsthand that intimidation alone could no longer dictate behavior or decision-making. Legally, our preparation proved invaluable. When the HOA attempted to issue additional fines or claim further violations, our comprehensive documentation and prior confrontation rendered their efforts ineffective. Lawyers were consulted only to verify the strength of our position, and it quickly became clear that the HOA's previous tactics bordered on harassment. Their attempts to enforce arbitrary rules on a property they did not fully control were legally indefensible. The realization that authority could be challenged and checked transformed our sense of agency and security. Psychologically, the victory was profound. Weeks of anxiety, fear, and exhaustion had left us on edge, yet the confrontation had affirmed our resilience. Each documented violation, each challenge met with calm and evidence, became a reminder of our capability to navigate and overcome unjust systems. Our home, once a stage of constant tension, regained its role as a sanctuary, a space where we could enjoy simple pleasures without the constant shadow of surveillance and intimidation. Even ordinary activities, from watering flowers to hosting small gatherings, now carried a renewed sense of freedom. Community perception had also shifted. Neighbors who had previously avoided engagement began to acknowledge our stand with quiet admiration. Some offered support, sharing resources or documentation of their own experiences with HOA overreach. Others sought advice on how to manage minor conflicts or navigate obscure rules. Our experience had become a subtle blueprint for resistance and empowerment, a testament to the impact a well-prepared and steadfast approach could have on a tightly knit community. As weeks turned into months, the HOA's attempts at enforcement became increasingly symbolic rather than substantive. Notices were rare, fines limited, and visits infrequent. The organization, once empowered by fear and intimidation, now operated under the awareness that its actions were visible, scrutinized, and accountable. The absurdity that had once defined interactions, dollar store uniforms, fabricated notices, and arbitrary inspections, faded into memory, replaced by a cautious procedural approach that respected legal boundaries and resident rights. The long-term consequences extended beyond our immediate household. By standing firm, documenting every infraction, and calmly confronting overreach, we had indirectly influenced the HOA's governance culture. Meetings were more transparent, rule enforcement was more consistent, and residents were increasingly aware of their rights. Individuals who had once relied on fear to maintain control found that compliance required evidence, clarity, and justification rather than arbitrary authority. Our experience became a subtle lesson in power dynamics, showing that systems, no matter how entrenched, can be challenged when approached strategically. Even the minor absurdities that had once punctuated daily life, strange vehicles circling the block, forged notices, and petty inspections, became anecdotal memories, reminders of the extremes to which unchecked authority could reach. These events, once sources of anxiety, now served as cautionary tales, both for us and the community. Discussions among neighbors frequently referenced the ordeal, often with incredulity, at the extent of the HOA's initial audacity and admiration for the resolution we achieved. The psychological impact of reclaiming our space and autonomy was not limited to us alone. Children, who had previously been wary of the subtle tensions in the neighborhood, began to enjoy the yard freely again. Family gatherings, once conducted under a quiet scrutiny, resumed with laughter and ease. Even the small rituals of suburban life, tending the garden, enjoying morning coffee on the porch, greeting neighbors, regained a sense of normalcy and joy. The home, reclaimed from the absurd grip of arbitrary authority, became a place where simple pleasures could once again thrive. A key aspect of the resolution was understanding that power must be balanced with accountability. The HOA, previously operating under the assumption that fear ensured compliance, now had to navigate a landscape of visibility and transparency. The combination of public observation, documented evidence, and legal grounding had transformed the dynamic. Where once threats held weight, now only legitimate, verifiable concerns carried authority. This shift was subtle but profound, altering the community culture and expectations of governance. Financially, the resolution was equally significant. Fines that once seemed inevitable were contested successfully, and no new penalties were imposed. The potential for legal escalation, once a looming threat, was neutralized by preparedness and documentation. We had turned the psychological burden of bureaucracy into tangible empowerment, converting the stress of harassment into proof of rights and resilience. The experience underscored the importance of diligence, calm strategy, and thorough documentation in navigating conflicts with organizations that wield authority unevenly. Emotionally, the experience reinforced a powerful lesson. Resilience is as much about preparation as it is about courage. Standing firm against absurdity, intimidation, and arbitrary enforcement required more than anger or frustration. It required careful observation, evidence collection, and a measured approach. The outcome was not just the cessation of harassment, it was a transformation of perception, confidence, and community dynamics. We had reclaimed agency over our property and our peace of mind, and in doing so, had set a precedent for others who might face similar challenges. Neighbors continued to share anecdotes, sometimes approaching us with small questions or requests for guidance on navigating HOA rules. The sense of community, initially fractured by tension and fear, began to mend slowly. Trust was rebuilt, not through fear or authority, but through transparency, accountability, and the demonstration that standing up to overreach could yield positive results. Our story became a quiet but influential catalyst for change, subtly shaping how the HOA operated and how residents engaged with governance. The resolution also highlighted the importance of communication. Calm, factual, and consistent dialogue, combined with documented evidence, had proven far more effective than confrontation driven by emotion alone. Each interaction, each rebuttal, each presentation of facts chipped away at the perception of invincibility that the HOA had cultivated. Over time, this methodical approach not only ended harassment, but also established a framework for fair, balanced, and predictable engagement between homeowners and governing bodies. In practical terms, the home regained its status as a sanctuary. Gardens flourished without fear of violation. Fences and mailboxes were respected, and the neighborhood's social fabric slowly began to repair itself. The once omnipresent anxiety over trivial infractions dissipated, replaced by confidence and autonomy. The home, reclaimed from the grip of overreach, became a symbol of resilience, preparation, and the power of standing firm against arbitrary authority. Legally, the HOA's behavior was now constrained by precedent and awareness of exposure. Attempts to fabricate violations or intimidate residents were tempered by the knowledge that evidence, public scrutiny, and legal frameworks could dismantle such tactics. Authority, once absolute in practice, was now bounded by accountability. The neighborhood had learned through our experience that standing up to overreach required courage, documentation, and strategic action, and that these tools could transform an oppressive system into one that respected resident rights. Reflecting. On the emotional journey, it became clear that the conflict had revealed more profound truths about power, control, and human behavior. The HOA's initial audacity, reliance on intimidation, and obsession with trivial rules exposed the dangers of unchecked authority. Our response, calm, prepared, and unwavering, demonstrated the capacity of individuals to reclaim agency even in the face of systemic overreach. The experience reshaped not only our perspective on governance and community dynamics, but also our understanding of resilience, patience, and the impact of strategic action. The ultimate takeaway for viewers, neighbors, and anyone facing similar conflicts is simple but profound. Preparation, documentation, and composure are powerful tools against arbitrary authority. The struggle was not resolved by confrontation alone, but by methodical strategy, calm persistence, and leveraging evidence to challenge overreach. Authority, no matter how entrenched, is accountable when faced with truth, transparency, and community awareness. Months later, the street returned to a semblance of peace. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, now tempered with a subtle awareness of the lessons learned. Neighbors engaged more cautiously but also more confidently, knowing that accountability could be enforced and overreach challenged. The HOA continued to exist, but its tactics were tempered and its ability to intimidate diminished. The community, once subtly fractured by fear and absurdity, had regained equilibrium. In retrospect, the conflict proved to be transformative. It reshaped our understanding of community dynamics, revealed the limitations of arbitrary power, and reinforced the value of evidence, persistence, and strategic response. Our home, once under siege by petty rules and intimidation, had become a symbol of resilience and empowerment. The resolution was not merely the cessation of harassment, but the long-term recalibration of authority, community expectations, and personal confidence. Even as the neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythms, the impact lingered. Conversations referenced the ordeal, and rules were enforced with greater clarity. As a result, residents felt emboldened to engage with governance without fear. Our experience had set a subtle precedent, demonstrating that even deeply entrenched organizations could be challenged when confronted with truth, preparation, and calm determination. Ultimately, the story concluded with a robust understanding. Power is most dangerous when unchallenged, and resilience is most effective when rooted in preparation and strategy. The HOA, once a source of absurdity and intimidation, had been exposed, constrained, and compelled to operate with accountability. The community had learned, the homeowners had triumphed, and the home itself, a space of daily life, family, and sanctuary, had been reclaimed. As we sat on the porch one evening, watching neighbors return to their routines and children play freely in the yard, the sense of relief was profound. The conflict had ended, but its lessons remained vivid. We had faced arbitrary authority, harassment, and absurdity head-on. We emerged not only victorious but wiser, more resilient, and empowered. And as the sun set over our quiet street, one thought lingered. when standing up to overreach, preparation, calm strategy, and unwavering resolve are more powerful than fear, intimidation, or authority ever could be. The home, the neighborhood, and our sense of security had been restored. But more importantly, the story served as a lasting reminder. Even in the most absurd, unjust, or intimidating circumstances, individuals can reclaim control, assert their rights, and inspire change, not through aggression, but through clarity, evidence, and steadfast courage. The impact of standing firm resonated far beyond the property lines, leaving a legacy of empowerment and accountability that would endure long after the last letter had been filed and the final visit concluded. The HOA dispute, once a source of anxiety, absurdity, and fear, had transformed into a narrative of resilience, strategy, and triumph. It was a story of empowerment, illustrating that even the most entrenched systems of control are vulnerable when faced with preparation, evidence, and unwavering determination. The conflict had been resolved, but its lessons about authority, power, community, and personal agency would endure, serving as a guide for anyone navigating the complex dynamics of neighborhood governance and asserting their rights in the face of arbitrary power. Our home, once under siege, was now truly ours again. And as the neighborhood settled into a renewed sense of balance, the ultimate takeaway became clear. No amount of fear, absurdity, or bureaucratic overreach can withstand the force of preparation, truth, and unwavering resolve. Authority is accountable, and resilience is a robust force. The impact of standing firm, documenting every step, and calmly asserting one's rights left an indelible mark on the HOA, on the community, and on us. The story had ended, but its lessons would reverberate for years to come, a testament to the power of courage, strategy, and the unyielding pursuit of justice.